Hello and welcome back to Climbing Mount Sophia. Once again, I'm joined by David Schindler, or DC Schindler. Thank you for coming. I'm so grateful to be with you again.
Oh, I'm really happy to see you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has. And we're going to hopefully continue with our exploration of David's wonderful book, Freedom from Reality, Diabolical Character of Modern Liberty. I wanted to, before we do that though, it's been about 3 weeks since the conference. I'm not sure if you were available or aware of it. There was a conference in Chino, California with John Vervaeke, Jonathan Pageau, and Paul Vanderklay and the theme was The Quest for a Spiritual Home.
Okay.
And
You had mentioned that. Yeah, that's the only way I've knew of it though. Yeah.
Okay. So I went to it, and I got to meet them all in person, which was really wonderful. But there were also quite a reasonable number of people there who it was a very odd experience for me because I'd never really been in a situation where people were knowing things about me before I got to meet them.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So that was
That
strange.
is a little disconcerting.
Yeah. But that was very humbling because I met a lot of people who were really, really sincere and very good-hearted people, and I had some really wonderful engagements. And your name came up very often, both in private conversation and in the conversations that were held in the centerpiece of the conference. And so I wanted you to be aware of that, and that you would know that your work is really making a very significant difference in a lot of these people's lives.
Thank you. That is nice to know. One wonders, as I've mentioned before. It doesn't surprise me though that you met a lot of good-hearted people. I suspect that that's the kind of person that would be attracted to your show.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. Yeah, it was a wonderful. Yeah, maybe another time we can talk about that, but it was wonderful. So I finished the book by this time, and I've as I went through it, I highlighted and underlined all kinds of things, and then I wrote notes, and so I have pages and pages of notes of things to talk to you about, and so I'm trying to condense them down to what is important. So if there's things that come up that you think, well, we'll cover this in a different way at a different time, or maybe we can roll this into something else, that's totally fine.
Okay.
We're sort of trying to do for the audience, we're sort of trying to do, at least my hope is to do sort of a medium depth exploration of this topic, not just kind of simply a what's this book about and kind of a superficial thing, but also obviously we can't actually just read the book. So somewhere in between.
That's great. Yeah, no, it's always helpful to try to rethink ideas at that level. A friend of mine once observed that you really can't say you know something unless you can put it simply. In fact, one of my colleagues said that she has come to the conclusion that something is not true unless it can be drawn with crayon for a 3-year-old. And I thought, yeah, there's really some wisdom to that observation.
Yeah, it seems sometimes the complexity is just a way of trying to find our way back out of the cave.
Yeah, good, very good point.
So I wanted to kind of pick up where we had left off. The last thing we talked about in our previous video in part 1 was unease, and John Locke's notion that the impetus for the will to move in a particular direction was unease, or a lack of peace, in a sense.
Right.
And that was contrasted with
I was
eros.
Say, it's the sort of diabolical substitute for attraction to the good.
Okay, yeah. Do you want to kind of just run us through unease versus eros, and then we'll pick up from there?
Yeah, I mean, eros is as I said, attraction to the good. It's one's response to beauty. I think I'm coming to think more about the importance of beauty in relation to eros. But anyway, for these purposes, it's the attraction to the good, which is positive, and it's something that moves one first. And sets one in motion, so that when one begins actively, deliberately to think and to act, you're already sort of recapitulating emotion. You're recapitulating at a higher level in a more in a more appropriated way, emotion that's already been, in a way you could say, given to you. And it's a positive movement. Now that, as a positive movement, it can fail in all sorts of ways. So you explain evil and privations and failures always with respect to a fundamental point of reference, which is this positive movement to the good. What the unease is a kind of imitation of that. You're still, in a way, heading in a direction, but rather than being drawn towards something that includes you, you're being actually impelled away from something that excludes you in a way. And from the outside, you can see something moving from point A to point B, and it looks the same in a way from both places, but actually considered more profoundly, there's a radical difference between the positive movement that includes one's own active participation and the negative imitation of that, which is a it's by force, it's by coercion, it's by you're acted on rather than acted in, as it were. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate that.
If actually, can I say one more thing about, and this is so I'm putting together a couple of things. One, I learned from Pierre Manon on the role of evil taking the place of the good as a founding principle for politics in Machiavelli. So that's a really interesting observation on his part. And then also an insight from Hannah Arendt, from whom I've received all sorts of light on many different things. But she talks about how this avoidance of pain, there's something about pain as distinct from pleasure that can be almost entirely self-referential. You don't need, in a way, to think of intrinsic relations and a reference to a principle that's moving one in order to make intelligible sense of pain, and in this case, unease. So the point with respect to Locke in this case is that what, rather than talking about desire for the good, talking about putting it in terms of recasting the very same dynamic in terms of unease, allows you to bracket out relationship to what precedes you as an essential context for intelligibility, and now it becomes entirely, in a way, self-referential. So it serves then a project of individualism in a much more clean way.
So, man, there's so many beautiful things there that I want to talk about. But one of the things that I actually, the last video I posted on my channel was a sort of just spontaneous reflection on the notion of pain and the notion of pleasure.
Oh, wow.
Although this one was primarily on the notion of pain, that started as a result of your quote of Hannah Arendt. Arendt, is that how you say it? Arendt. Hannah Arendt. The quote that you have of her toward the end of the book, it kind of opened that up for me. And so it's interesting to me that you bring that up here, because one of the things that I was thinking about with that was core to this, the argument you're making in this book seems to be the priority of what is taken to be actual.
Right.
And that if you take what is actual to be good, or what is good to be actual, then it's this sort of love, beauty, freedom in a real sense that draws you deeper into the depths of reality. And then on the other side, there's this pain. And if you take pain to be actual in this sort of self-referential way, if that's sort of the base, if that's your bottom of your ontology, then what is actual is actually, like, what you take to be actual in reality is not, in fact, the good, it's actually the evil. And that's sort of this like fundamental inversion of the whole project.
Oh, no, that's right. And I mean, that's a really crucial point. I mean, the two comments on that. One is that um, the I think it's worth reflecting on the qualitative difference of these two visions. So one is good is what's most basic. The other is, in a way, you could say evil is what's most basic, or at least appears to be most basic. And that's
Yeah.
the
Or
second
at
point.
least
Just a second.
or at least mechanistic chaos, maybe?
Yeah, right. Meaninglessness, that there's not an actual meaning, but there's just sort of the void and atoms in the void or something like that. Yeah. In the these aren't just like two alternative ways of looking at the world. They're asymmetrically related, and the differences are really pervasive. So in the one, the priority of the good and the good as actuality, and that's a classic axiom that actuality is perfection. So that's something that takes some time to think about because it's so different from our normal way of thinking. But that's really is an axiom in the classical worldview. But everything is in the first place um, part of the proper meaning in which you're participating. So things fit together. They're not immediately threats. There may be things that are threatening, but the most fundamental meaning is positivity, is harmony, is a kind of meaningfulness where things have a fit, and if they don't fit, you can realize that because you know what it would mean to fit. That's just the sense given context. Whereas in the moment you take that sense of actuality out of the picture, then everything, even in its neutrality, in a way, is sort of a threat because it's not part of the meaning of the whole. It's a foreign intrusion in a way, and everything becomes a kind of a foreign intrusion, and that's going to change the way uh, the very structure of things and the intelligibility of things, desirability, the meaning of beauty, all the way up. That's gonna change all. Now, the second point, though, let me just sort of sneak that in there that I think is really important, is this view of things always being a threat that can never be primordial. That's always going to be parasitical on some deeper sense that in fact that's not the way things are. There's
Yeah.
always going to be. It can only appear to one that way. It can't ever be the case, and one can't ever. Whatever one thinks one knows, this is deeper than that. One really truly knows that it's not that way. I that this the positivity of the good and actuality, I think, is this is why Plato called it an unhypothetical first principle. You know, it's not a hypothesis. It's already there. You can't just take it for, it's the foundation on which you consider any other hypothesis. It's always, you're always too late if you try to make it just an option.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I was thinking there was that you talk about sort of the primordiality of the
Yeah.
goodness of actuality. And for better or worse, even if you hate everything about your life and you wish you were dead, you're wishing against the primordial life that's being like provided to your conscious awareness by your body itself. That you
Yeah, I
have
mean,
to.
even right. Wishing you're dead is sort of wishing you were in a better place. I mean, so in other words, you want to return to some sense of what it's better than this.
Yeah. Oh,
So
that's funny.
it's still caught by the good.
Oh man, there's something beautifully humorous about that. Wow.
Yeah.
like I
Yeah.
like there's sort of a morbid humor, but it's, oh man, it is like, this is one of the things I love about the way you argue things. I love how you have this sort of graciousness in your arguments, and then you sort of always turn it back around to where it's like, well, no matter, I mean, sure, you can go this way, but no matter where you go, you're still ending up here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that that's. I think that's reality. Just is, that's reality, and argument is trying to just put in words as well as one can what is in fact the case. So there's not, you know, it's that's yeah. It comes from a deeper source. That's the point. Yeah, but I mean, the thing about, as you say, it's sort of human. Um, um, One of the reasons that one can be tortured by the sense of suicide. I mean, the thing is, if this were not the case, then suicide would be, you wouldn't be tortured by the thought. It would be just
Mm,
as simple and basic as not killing yourself.
mm,
Those would be equally, meaningful alternatives. But I mean, people that I know that have really suffered from this, I mean, that's not how they experience it. So when a person will present suicide as a kind of uh, um, demonstration of the falsity of the absoluteness of goodness or something like that, to me, that's not. It's simply not compelling proof. I mean, quite the
right.
contrary.
It doesn't go deep enough in its
Yeah,
analysis.
yeah, that's right.
I wanted to ask you another thought that I was having when you were unfolding that was, do you think this shift of taking to be most real pain and privation
Hmm.
and taking pleasure and goodness, which you talk about Locke as straightforwardly making pleasure and goodness a thing to be striven for by the
Hmm.
will and not the basic starting point. But
Yeah.
is that term turn sort of the fundamental move of modernism?
Huh. Yeah, yeah, I think so. You put your finger on the precise point that the goodness is something that you can reach rather than something that's presupposed. I mean, that really is kind of the key. Um, yeah, I think so. I think that
Mm,
that would be interesting to think about it. T.S. Eliot has an interesting reflection on liberalism. Um, uh, and defines it precisely. I mean, it's kind of a making the same point we made earlier, but it's not defined by that towards which it moves, but that from which it is is pushed. It's got a kind of a centrifugal movement as opposed to centripetal movement, and that's something essential to modernity. And I think that that's true. I'm beginning to um, think increasingly, I'm increasingly convinced that at the heart of all of this, I'm reading a fascinating book right now. I don't want to get us off on a side topic, but really fascinating book by Ivan Illich on gender and what he calls vernacular culture. It's really fascinating. But
mm,
he describes the essential kind of modern turn, and he borrows in some ways from Karl Polanyi in this, and I think one can include Charles Taylor later, but a sort of a disembedded self that one's taken out of context, and then um, the context is then entirely rethought as a kind of superficial accumulation of stuff on a core that is essentially um, pure potency or pure power or kind of pure. One is just an abstract chooser or something like that. And I'm increasingly convinced that this uh, um, phenomenon, this novel reconception of the human being, is made possible by Christianity in the very strange sense that it was Christianity not understood as simply a faith, but understood as a whole culture that includes the entire cosmos and all of history and gives shape to the entirety of existence. If one wants to reject that, it can only be by completely disembedding from everything that defines one. so that this total redefinition of the human being is made possible by a preceding total definition that was given in the tradition, the historical tradition, Christian tradition. Now, and which is why, this modernity is kind of a particularly Western phenomenon. And I don't know enough about Eastern cultures to know what modernity looks like and how it arose in their cultures. I mean, and we all know in some part it's through some contact with the West, but
Right.
but I don't know enough about the history to
Yeah.
speak to.
Yeah. I don't either, but from a low level colonialism like springs to mind. But
Yeah, yeah. But even but the point is that we're trying to get out of any and all contexts,
right,
and then
right.
try to rethink everything from that. And that's the essence of modernity, and it's connected to why pain would take the place of pleasure and the good, because that's always an embedded thing and concrete.
I just finished C.S. Lewis's Ransom trilogy.
Oh yeah.
Which is a wonderful, just wonderful set of books. And
Yeah.
this is very much seems to me like the kind of the through line of his of those books, because one of the things that is interesting, you talk about sort of the attempt to kind of push reality away, is that if you want to point to the successes of modernity, you talk about landing man on the moon and the possibility of colonizing Mars.
Yeah.
And that what's defined our most wealthy and most powerful people has been recently this sort of frivolous goal of who can get into space first with their own private sort of enterprise.
Isn't that extra? That's just perfect?
Yeah. It's just it's so wonderful. Like once I kind of started to see how all of our actions were just kind of manifesting whatever the philosophy is that we have underneath ourselves.
Yeah, but isn't that
works.
Yeah, we mentioned Hannah Arendt. If you have not read it, it's really worth reading her book, The Human Condition.
Okay.
And it begins with a reference to, I believe it begins, it's been a while since I've looked at it. I don't know if this is the absolute beginning or it comes early on, but in any event, she refers to our landing on the moon as the like perfect symbol of the modern disembeddedness, this flight from home, from one's concrete actual place. And I hadn't made the connection, but you're exactly right. It's fascinating how the leaders of our culture are all trying to get into space. And I don't know if you recall when Bezos went up, there was apparently a petition that was signed by hundreds and hundreds of people to not let him back on Earth.
Right, as if that was something we could do even. But yeah,
that's right.
If we can leave it, you would hope we could at least keep it away.
Yeah.
But anyway, man, that's just that's the funny thing about symbolism, is you act it out whether you understand it or not.
Well, I mean, that opens up a whole new line of thought, but that's really it.
Let's do it.
Yeah. But how some people, for example, with my book Freedom from Reality, one criticism of it was that and this is a common criticism of a lot of people who write critiques of modernity. So Communio, the journal that I represent, that's been sort of arguing for critique. Oftentimes, when one hears the complaint that it presupposes that like ideas are all that we have, and that people are driven entirely by ideas, and so the logic of an idea is going to be the logic of history, and that ideas have a kind of deterministic view, and that's really not it at all. It's that maybe a different way to put it is that that criticism makes sense if you think of ideas as abstractions. if you presuppose a modern sense of idea as an abstract concept, it's very different if you think that ideas are actualities that are symbolic realities in which we live and move and have our being and set the horizon for all of the things that we think and do in a way that has a kind of intelligibility that one can articulate, formulate as a concept, but one's one's giving a conceptual account of a reality. And it seems to me that that's really the key is that that I'm sort of been working on developing this idea of a symbolic order. I mean, it seems to me that modernity is a symbolic order in that frames our existence in a way that has a kind of intelligibility, but that doesn't mean that anybody is doing it deliberately. Mm-hmm. It's a much more kind of concrete, organic. The way that symbols communicate meaning, I think, is really helpful. Mm-hmm. So that for example, the way that I'm kind of bringing a lot of things together here, so you can help me untangle them, maybe. But when people say, "Well, where did modernity come from?" Was it that a couple of guys had an idea somewhere and some wrote them in the book, and then suddenly? No, to me, it's a symbolic order, like a comprehensive symbolic order, comes into being in the way that a language does. So one could say, one could raise the question, who invented English?
Right.
Like where did the English language come from? And I mean, there's a clear distinction between English and Latin. It's got its own kind of internal coherence, but it's not like somebody at some point came up with it. It sort of grew naturally, but that natural growth doesn't mean that it was sort of independent of people's minds and so forth. I mean, it's a much more, it's mysterious, but it seems to me that that's the kind of ideas move in history in the way that languages do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, John talks about collective intelligences.
Yeah,
and him and Jonathan have had some conversations because they're sort of working out how well the principalities and powers, angels and demons, can map onto some of these ideas of in modern cognitive science, these ideas around collective intelligence, and how there is sort of a way in which there can be a multiplicity of individuals working even even sometimes in what they think to be oppositional ways, even what they think might be adversarial ways, but they're actually, like, the way that they're acting, they're so embedded in the forms. Right? Because I think that's why the forms is so much better than the ideas, because it's like,
there you go.
I don't know. I guess I almost, it's almost as if ideas are like this, this symphony of I don't know. I almost imagine them as like strings in a symphony, in a symphonic kind of musical resonance, and that's it's on the strings that the material sort of organizes itself into what it is. And there's actually some really interesting things in biology, and some of the work that a guy by the name of Michael Levin is doing, and other folks trying to understand how. Well, because basically they've discovered, as well as I understand it, they've come to a point where it can't be there's not possibly enough information, or information even in the right mode, stored within DNA in sort of a materially representative fashion to explain development. It can't. And so there's something else going on. And Michael Levin is a guy who has worked out and started to understand things about electrochemical gradients and these electric fields that are sort of doing, sort of like where the forms take place. and he can do, you know, like limb regeneration and things like this. Like there's people that are actually working on doing, you know, limb regeneration in the way of like you just signal your cells, hey, you built an arm before, can just do it again.
Yeah.
And they are actually doing it.
Yeah.
And and so I guess all that to
Yeah.
say, like, I think
I mean, it certainly, well, I'll let you finish.
no,
Yeah.
no,
Just,
go ahead.
well, I mean, it certainly complexifies what we mean by causality. I mean, we can't get out of this idea that causes operate like, you know, billiard balls, and that there's just, you know, it's a simple imposition of force from one material thing to another. And you know, obviously, Aristotle had a much more complex view with material, formal, final, efficient causes, that every causal event is sort of a symphony. And the Neoplatonic tradition that took that up with Dionysius, that reinterprets all that in terms of goodness and beauty as the causality of all causes, that articulates it in this way. And then Aquinas introduces um, uh, the notion of esse to be the actuality of all causes. And then in modern context, you know, you have to deal with quantum mechanics and you know, Wolfgang Smith's notion of vertical causality. And you realize that there's a much more satisfying way of thinking about causality that just makes much more sense of just everyday experiences than this very abstract kind of billiard ball
Yeah.
model that for some reason we can't seem to shake. That seems to be in the popular, you know, to speak of collective consciousness or intelligence, you know, that seems to be kind of governing the horizon of our thinking in a way that's been very stubborn, and you know, forces us to reduce in all sorts of unsatisfying ways these phenomena that are right in front of our faces, that are just as plain as can be.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, you know, it's
and
funny.
I emphasize that point because some people think that this is getting into mysticism, and it's not. Actually, there's something much more mystical about billiard balls, you know, that don't in fact explain what's, you know,
Yeah, right.
when you really enter into the depths of these other finer, more qualitative and sophisticated sense of causality, you realize that they're much closer to actual everyday sense experience.
Well, and the god of modernity is sort of an abstract mechanical wizard, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So I mean that's very sort of mystical. It's totally hand wavy, right?
Yeah.
It's like, well,
Yeah.
here's what is, this is how we can say what it is, and everything else, well, we don't know how it happens. It just happens. And we're not, you know.
Yeah, and then when you run out of explanatory power, then you refer to the wizard and the, you know, which is God as pure potency, you know, as pure power, pure inscrutable power, as opposed to the actual and good God that has in fact revealed himself in history, you know,
Yeah.
you know, rather than starting from goodness to bring it back there. And that's why, I mean, you know, in the end, it's a kind of symbolic versus a sort of diabolical. You know, you either have a cosmos that makes sense and fits together, basically, um, or you have, yeah, just power relations, meaningless power relations that are constantly thwarting each other and in radical competition and
Yeah.
hostility. Ultimately.
Yeah. Well, if it is a sort of a symbolic order of modernity that constantly or only can exist by subverting itself, then I suppose eventually it has to subvert itself on every level. And it seems like its golden child of science is sort of doing that already.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Say more of what you mean by that. That's very interesting.
Well, in the sense that, you know, kind of at the core of it, it kind of starts with this whole movement, like we talked about, of prior understanding pain to be what's actual and understanding our relationship to the world as being one of trying to pull ourselves up over pain in a sense,
Yeah,
like to to become gods, you know, must we not
right.
ourselves become gods simply to be worthy of it?
Yeah, Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that sort of necessarily, as you argue really well in multiple of your works, but especially this one, that it necessarily is diabolical, and that it subverts itself and places everything in opposition to each other, and everything in opposition to each other. A house divided against itself cannot stand.
Yeah.
And even even that which is produced from that sort of upwelling,
Hmm.
that of that jumping away, we have produced something very real, and in many ways really very good, especially at
Yeah.
dispelling a particular level of human suffering. And that has been science, I'll take it, basically, which has
Yeah.
provided us the ability to do many of the wonderful things that we do. And I am a scientist. I make decisions. I help people to make decisions based on particular scientific research. That's what my job is.
Yeah.
And
Right.
and so I'm not decrying science, but I'm suggesting that maybe, modernity sort of gave birth to science, and it's the kind of golden child that is, the answer to everything, and why it's all worth it. But in a sense, it's what, if we follow it through, it actually undermines the
Yeah.
the basic tenets of modernity itself.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's right. And I mean, that's the curious way that it's hopeful, that hope sort of emerges paradoxically. But I think I understand your point better now. And I mean, that's a really fascinating, though very troubling phenomenon, is this kind of self-subversion. So I mentioned Ivan Illich. He talks about a kind of he doesn't go into the metaphysical dimensions of things. His discussion is always very sociological, but um, the kind of essential counterproductivity and
Mm-hmm.
that we see in modern culture. And I mean, you can multiply the examples. Has the proliferation of time-saving devices given us more leisure time? I mean, nobody thinks so. And I mean, and that's curious. There was a movie way before you were born that I don't know if you would have heard it or seen it, called The Gods Must Be Crazy.
Oh, I love that movie. Yes,
Oh, okay,
yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Actually, that was one of the earliest movies of my childhood that I ever watched.
Oh wow,
Yeah.
wow. There you go. So, but there's a reflection in the beginning about how much leisure time, how much time was spent in leisure activities in this sort of primitive culture that had absolutely no time-saving devices compared to, I mean, it was just, most of the time, I mean, we project this view of life as desperate, you know, that if you're not working like mad, you're going to die. When in fact, you know, and obviously there are threats, natural threats, and so forth. But a culture that's based on subsistence tends to have a lot of time just to kind of hang out and tell stories and play music and dance. I mean and you don't need to be scrambling constantly. But I mean, you can go through the different things. I mean, COVID, we introduced a whole plan to protect ourselves, but as we've found, and I think we'll find increasingly, we actually did much more damage. In terms of, even just on the very in terms of health, physical health. I mean, how is it that the very things that have been invented to solve a problem intensify the problem that they mean to solve? Now, that isn't meant to be, as you were saying, it's not meant to be like a blanket criticism. It's just that you recognize that for the kinds of things, modes of thought and productions of science and technology to be meaningful and genuinely beneficial to human existence, we can't ever absolutize them outside of a context. We always need to think of them concretely inside of the human reality that they're meant to serve. And that, the thing is that changes things pretty dramatically. And we're very little equipped for that kind of thinking in our culture. We don't really have the institutions and the values really to help us cultivate those sorts of habits.
Yeah.
And but as you say, we're in a way, so a culture that is founded, for instance, on pure physical pleasure will find out that there isn't any physical pleasure. Like the even physical pleasure itself becomes impossible to find.
Yeah.
So I mean, and that's where a real conversion can happen, because there's a moment which you it's not like some foreign concern has to be introduced for you to turn around. Your very desire for physical pleasure is going to show you this isn't the way to do it.
Right.
And that's why I really hope. Yeah.
Well,
So
sorry.
We'll see what happens. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, if we actually have faith in the good, it's necessarily going to be the case. It's more of just a question of, well, how many people die in the meantime and how much suffering is there?
Yeah.
And it's already burning itself down, right? Like I think we've kind of reached the end of that. I see. It strikes me that, and I hesitate to even bring it up because I would really love to talk to you sometime about AI. And I think having a conversation with you and John about AI would be really fascinating.
Let's get that on the docket. I would love to do that.
Yeah, maybe that could be our next one. I know we have another one coming up.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I'm struck by the possibility that one of the reasons that many people are so thrilled about AI is it provides another sort of like it's almost like another ontological layer of jumping away from reality, because like, we've pretty much burned everything out on this one, and it's like, okay, we need somewhere else to go, because we're all sort of like, in a room that's full of water and there's very little air to breathe still on the ceiling.
No, I mean, this is going to be something that people will need to reflect on for many, many years. I mean, this really is the next big topic. But it is amazing. It's another example of the kind of self-subverting endeavors that plague specifically modern society. So for instance, I was just thinking about this yesterday. What if somebody said, "Look, you don't need to go to the gym anymore and lift weights. Um, uh, here's a robot that can lift the weights for you, and go to the gym for you, and so you don't have to go." Now we all recognize that that's ridiculous. Why? Because it's not about just producing a certain number of reps of a weight. It's actually about becoming strong. And there's no technological substitute that you can create for that, the acquisition of that virtue, to use the classical language. But the thing is, thinking is we have to recognize it's the same sort of thing. You can have now a computer write your papers for you, but it would be like sending the robot to the gym. I mean, you've totally missed the point, and you're going to regret it. There's a way in which we're increasingly persuaded, and I think it's catastrophic actually, but we're increasingly persuaded that thinking is about producing results. Solving problems or something like that, as opposed to recognizing that thinking is actually a spiritual act that is has a kind of in itselfness, that a sort of intrinsic perfection, independent of its consequences, independent of any of its effects. Just to think something properly is actually a profound human achievement. And this is especially clear. I did listen to John's discussion of AI and his
Mm.
characterization of reason as caring for reality. I mean, that's exactly, and that's why that's not something that we can have a technological substitute for by definition.
Well, I
Um,
wonder, I was thinking, because I'm still kind of playing with this flight from the real issue, and
yeah,
it's like, if this
yeah,
is reality, and this is sort of like, this line is the unfolding of reality, and our reason is to sort of walk along with it. But as soon
yeah,
as our reason becomes, you know, instrumental to whatever end we choose, we sort of start doing this,
yeah.
and then we kind of get in a loop like this, and like now we're disconnected.
Yeah, no, that's a lovely picture. There you go. For a 3-year-old, you could draw that with a crayon, and so it's got to be true. Um, I mean that really is it, and then it spirals in on itself, and then it loses any reference point, and then
Mhm.
you don't know, am I thinking something right or wrong? You can't even tell. There's no
Yeah. Well, as you
grounding
say,
that gives it direction.
yeah, yeah. Well, and as you say here, I didn't have it picked out as a as something to talk about today, so I'm not going to grab it right now. But it's that this is exactly how the good becomes subjective.
Oh,
You know,
right.
the
Yeah.
good becomes a subjective. You know, for Locke, it's that which we find pleasure in we call good, and that which we find pain in we call evil.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's all that's left for you.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. And that becomes self-referential, and then you don't really understand, I mean, things always come back to Plato's cave. I mean, it's such a perfect instance there, but and here you can make the Matrix references too. What could possibly be wrong once you have, you know, basically conceded a disconnection, which I think in a way has been conceded for us largely in ways that's really um, not any individual's fault. I mean, we're in a culture where this is just what defines the horizon. But what reason could you possibly give to someone to say that uh, the subjective feeling that life is good is without qualification, equivalent to its being good, and that some sort of a medication that masks any deviation from that, um, you that would just seem like the answer to all problems. And within that horizon, it is the answer to all problems.
Right,
Now, I think
right.
there's enough humanity in people to recognize that there's something perverse about that.
Yeah.
Um, but there's not much in the way of resources to substantiate that intuition that we have.
Yeah. Okay, I want to pick up from there with, because this is a good segue into something I really wanted to talk about, because when you were talking about, what can you say to people? Because we've already, like, we're kind of born into this disconnected state.
Yeah.
And, I think while there were glimpses of it around me, I don't think I really had any contact until I was, sometime in my mid-20s. Um, and I think the biggest reason for me why is what I want to bring up now, which is that, so this is a section talking about what happens in this with the subjectiveness, the turn toward a subjective good, and that for Locke there is still a normative dimension, but he moves it. And
Hmm. Hmm.
for Locke, the normative dimension is imposed in a wholly extrinsic manner through divine judgment. It is transcendent, not in the radical classical sense that coincides with constant immanent presence, but in a purely extrinsic way. The moral significance comes through what is a historical event, namely a divine judgment that will occur in a time after this life. And I want to pair it with a this is all jumping all the way forward to page 190 in a section called The Garden and the Cave, talking about, and you're kind of giving us a peek through the curtains to some of the things going on in the maybe sort of the psychological shift that happens with the serpent's temptation of Eve. There's 3 points. They're all excellent, but I'm just going to pick up on the second one here. In the moment of transformation, in this moment, there is a transformation of the intrinsically hierarchical order of goodness into the terms of power. God's command regarding the tree of knowledge becomes the pronouncement of what Locke would call an arbitrary will. It ceases, in other words, to be a creative statement of the truth of things, a limit that makes the whole a whole, and instead becomes an imposition that is not in any way measured by goodness. This may be good for you, but it is off limits.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So did you want me to comment on that, or did you have a particular question, or wanted to relate those two?
Well, let me try to. So I want to pull together a couple things from earlier in our conversation and these 2 points, because this movement of that we talked about earlier is taking pain to be primary, the negative aspect, the competitiveness, the harshness of reality as primary, and our understanding of the normative order of of our morality as being an extrinsic thing imposed upon us from above. Like, those two things seem to coincide and happen at the same time, and they necessarily, like, it's like heaven and earth get turned upside down, and we start to push out the side, or is that's what we try to do?
Right. Yeah, right. And that's I mean, that's nice how you put it. It really is a reconception of order that's going on, and those are two different dimensions of a similar reconception of order. And you know, one is there's the difference between, you know, so what I call symbolic orders, where things fit together, from the etymology of symbol. I think we've talked about this before, but and in that case, you have a self that has a certain independence, but precisely because of a positive relation to the things that are other than it. And ultimately, this is what sense we make of, you know, so in this case, limits are part of what positively define things and give them their in sense and intelligibility and their purpose and their scope of movement and their capacity and therefore harmony, their capacity to be different from what's other, and but in a way that's not threatening, all that kind of stuff. But limits are fundamentally positive. What happens with the shift is that you break apart the self and the other, and so you have, on the one hand, pure autonomy, and then pure heteronomy. And Kant uses the word heteronomy to talk about a law that's imposed in an entirely extrinsic way on us. Now, the word autonomy is not even properly put. The old meaning of that, and I talk about this in the book, I mean, the original meaning, or the etymological meaning, is that it's the appropriation of the law into the self, so that one internalizes the order.
Okay. Interesting.
Autonomos. The modern sense of that, where there's a division and an opposition, is something more like auto tyranny, because it's rule without order. But now the self is the rule over itself and over, you know, and anything that it kind of can take control of, without reference to a greater order. And that means then any order that arises is always going to be a threat and an imposition and a kind of violent limitation that is restricting my freedom and threatening the integrity of myself. And that gives rise to all sorts of cultural institutions that end up recapitulating the problem and so forth. I mean, that's a big part of the discussion of the book. But at the heart of it is this idea that you refer to Locke's sense of divine judgment as being the final guarantor. That is something that is an arbitrary judgment for him that happens in time, and you are going to change your behavior because of a concern about the pleasure or pain you're going to feel in the end, and that's going to be for a much longer time. And so, in sort of purely quantitative terms, you can kind of figure out your morality. But you see, that's a kind of a purely linear, temporal, horizontal consideration. The classical one, which has the vertical, recognizes that the transcendent principle in good and evil is not just an arbitrary judgment, but has to do with the very nature of things. And that means also my nature now. And so that determination affects life at every moment.
Yeah. You are always
not out of
judged
fear
already.
of consequences. Yeah, that's right. That's right. We're always judged already by God, but also by the good, and therefore in some fundamental way by ourselves.
Right.
In our very being, we are autonomous. We're internalizing in a way that constitutes our independence, and this is what makes us increasingly sort of substantial free selves, is by entering more and more deeply into the goodness that's been given to us. Is a way of putting it.
I've thought a lot about that line in, well, it's throughout the Gospels, especially in the Lord's Prayer: forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. And the notion of forgiveness and the mote in your brother's eye, and kind of superimposing that with the notion of a non-monadic self that John would talk about, and that we know ourselves through the eyes of others.
Yeah.
The notion of forgiveness and the notion of judging your neighbor, and like those somehow become very much less arbitrary very quickly, because you start to realize that it's precisely to the degree that I judge my neighbor that I receive judgment in myself of myself.
Yeah.
And because I have a very, very harsh internal critic, which is I'm very grateful for, because that's a large part of why I've undertaken the journey that I'm on. But something that I've learned from it is how it primarily gets its fuel from a critique I have of someone or something else.
Oh, right. Yeah. No, that's you. I'm just going to be repeating what you said so beautifully there. I mean, because we tend to think of, like, in Lockean terms, don't be mean to somebody because that might make them be mean to you. And so you've got this very consequentialist and sequentialist sort of view. But it's a deeper thing, that the attitude that you present, your disposition to reality, is coincident with reality's disposition towards you.
Yeah.
And those things are really inseparable. And I mean, we have that experience in all sorts of profound ways, all over the place. But it is true, and it's interesting. I mean, psychological. I'm not a psychologist, but I suspect and have been told that if you want to find out something about yourself, think about the kinds of things that you tend to critique most in other people, and you'll discover that reveals something about what's going on in you. I mean, all of those things, I think, can be illuminating.
Yeah, and the golden rule has a whole new flavor from this angle.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's like, well, first you have to understand what you would like to be done unto you. And that's not nearly as simple of a question as I think. Most of us think that's an obvious answer, but I found it not to be an obvious answer in my own life.
Yeah. You're more thoughtful than most.
Well, we're probably coming to the end of our time here. You mentioned, and I don't think we've actually done it, at least not in this series. So maybe what we could end with would be if you could sort of try to draw together the symbolic and the symbolical and the diabolic and the diabolical. I know we've put them other places, but to sort of ground us then to, I'd like to next time we come back to talk about the cultural manifestations of these issues that you bring out.
Yeah.
And so maybe you could give us a ground for the symbolical and the diabolical.
Yeah, yeah. This is something I'd like to pursue further with Jonathan Pajot. He and I on your show, like, this came up, and we've got a slightly different take on this, and it would I would find it very illuminating. He's obviously given so much thought to these questions, but let me set that aside. I mean, the heart of it is that a universe that is caused by a ultimate, absolutely good and beautiful first principle, and therefore the expression of generosity, which is the Christian Neoplatonic vision, that gives rise to an essentially symbolic order. That and symbol, the etymology is that things join together, come together, fit together. We tend to think of it epistemologically in terms of signs that communicate meaning, and that's one dimension of it. But there's a lot more to it, and it's things are meaningful, not only in themselves but in a harmonious whole. And that the best way to understand the parts in a symbolic cosmos is to see them in their embeddedness in the whole, and that kind of organic relation. Now, the diabolical is the etymological opposite of the symbolic. It's the casting asunder rather than seeing as recognizing, receiving as joined. And to my mind, that just there's a logic of that seems to capture so much about the modern world. This kind of especially when one adds the overtones that are the connotations of the diabolical, the father of lies, deception, substitution. Making a deal that turns out to be, that sort of comes back to haunt one. The idea of never being able to connect and so forth. There's so much in the logic of that I think gives expression to, amazingly, what we mean by freedom, even in the when we try to talk about it positively in the modern West, and especially in America, we're sort of a nation founded on freedom. I think in spite of ourselves, if we were to spell out what that means, it would be much more in the sense of keeping things apart. This kind of expressions of the diabolical logic. So that to me is just a kind of a helpful basic context to think about some of these cultural themes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, this has been lovely, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, it's great talking to you.
I look forward to next time.
Yes, me too.